completely different topic, which is microdosing. So we're going to cover a lot of the basics of microdosing 101. How many of you are already familiar with the term microdosing a little bit at least? Okay, so a good number of hands. Good. And then of course James mentioned it, and kind of laid a great foundation for me to start at. So as James had mentioned, microdosing is a sub-perceptual or a sub-hallucinogenic or a sub-intoxicating dose of a psychedelic. This usually applies to a lot of your classical psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, or usually. I've heard of people microdosing other psychedelics, but in terms of research, and usually what's out there tends to lean into those two. So a general microdose size is usually about 1/10 of what you consider a standard journey size or a standard macro dose. So with that, again, it's not inducing any sort of functional impairment. Some people report a number of different experiences in terms, well, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but we'll get into some of the things that people do experience and that they do tend to report. It's, again, not any sort of functional alteration in the ability to function or being inebriated or intoxicated at all. But real quickly, in terms of some of the history of microdosing, reports go back to Albert Hofmann, the man who discovered LSD, or took LSD first, and it was reported that he had began microdosing, and he had talked to privately about this, and so then this was reported to Robert Forte, and then Robert Forte has talked with James Fadiman. James Fadiman has a book that I'll provide the reference to at the back here. He was the first one to really start talking about microdosing more publicly. And now there's a lot of different resources on microdosing, and we'll get into some of the specific ones. I don't know if I mentioned it here, no, but I mentioned it at the end. So I'll provide some of those resources. But there are a few different protocols, and there's not a standard protocol for microdosing. There are a few that are out there, and there might be slight deviations in the approaches. The first one, like I mentioned, James Fadiman was one of the first to really publicly talk about microdosing, and his protocol is generally 1 day on, 1 day off. So what you're doing is allowing for a period of reflection after a single microdose. And that's usually done in a regimen, doing that cycle over a period of a few weeks, and then taking a break for at least a couple of weeks. And then there's the idea of stacking and the Stamets protocol. So Paul Stamets, huge advocate for psilocybin and mushrooms as a whole. He's developed a particular protocol that couples lion's mane mushrooms and lion's mane mushroom niacin along with a microdose of psilocybin. Reason for this is, and he's taken a look at this and he's confirmed it now through all of his research, is they work synergistically. Lion's mane mushroom has a great affinity for the brain and also allowing for neuroconnections, neuroplasticity, neurogenesis. And the two combined seem to have greater, by definition, synergy is they have a greater effect together than if you were just taking the psilocybin or just taking the lion's mane, or in theory combining them. You get it. It's a 1 + 1 = 3 type situation instead of 1 + 1 = 2. So the stacking protocol couples those two together, and then niacin is used. It's a flushing form of niacin. If anybody's taken niacin, you get these kind of like body flush or temperature raise. It can sometimes be rather uncomfortable. But the reason for this is that niacin is a vasodilator. I've not only done this protocol, but I've also done modifications of that protocol without using flushing niacin, and some of what I integrate that I'll talk about on Saturday. Doesn't use niacin, it uses other herbs that are vasodilators with the same principle in mind. But the Stamets stack and the Stamets protocol is that niacin, lion's mane, and a microdose of psilocybin. And what that looks like is it's usually you microdose for 4 days at a time, and then you take 3 days off. And it's a weekly cycle that you do usually for a few weeks again, and then generally take a break for a couple weeks. And these breaks are designed so that you're not constantly taking a microdose on a daily basis. Most of the regimens or most of the protocols that are out there don't have you microdosing every day. They have a built-in at least day of rest in between, or a few days. In terms of approaches to neurorehabilitation, when I do clinically working with TBI and stroke, we take the same sort of principle, and where we do something rather frequently for a few days, and then give the body sort of an opportunity to rest and reestablish that as a baseline as much as possible, and then reintroduce. There's also consideration, and there's been a lot of talk in terms of ongoing ingestion of psilocybin and influences that it may have on the serotonin 2B receptor. And again, I think it was last year, there's a lot of research that's coming out in the last year or two, but it has backed up that can increase some cardiovascular risk by taking it chronically, like if you were to take it every day, like a supplement or as a prescription. And so what these protocols also allow is to reduce or minimizing sort of risk along those lines, because again, you're allowing your body to not build up any sort of chronic, ongoing, constant stimulation of those receptors, but giving the body a chance to work through that and let that settle out. Okay, so these are some of the commonly self-reported effects of microdosing that people will talk about. Some people report that they just generally feel better, they feel good, they feel in a good place. Again, they're not altered, they're not impaired in any way, but they might report that they have more energy or more creativity. Often when you hear about microdosing, especially related to Silicon Valley, talk about microdosing for creativity. Clearer thinking, increased problem-solving ability, increased focus, increased awareness, a generally more positive mood, and being a little bit more present in the moment. It's not completely without its risks. So we kind of already talked about the biggie there, being the chronic ongoing stimulation of the serotonin 2B receptor, and how they can influence the cardiovascular system, and why these protocols are sort of built out with a period of rest in there. Some people will mention or report increased levels of anxiety as their nervous system is activated a little bit. Fatigue is usually not a big one. Sometimes people will report difficulty sleeping. Some people will report headaches. All in all, the risks, other than the ongoing administration and the cardiovascular association there, tend to be relatively minor. So you feel a little bit uncomfortable for a period of time. There's a great, if you're not familiar with this resource and interested in microdosing, I highly recommend looking into this, microdose.me. Paul Stamets is associated with that. It is a large-scale self-report study where people who are microdosing, it's basically people all around the world who have signed up for this and self-elected to report their experiences with microdosing. So it's a large-scale self-report evidence in terms of microdosing. So they'll ask you a bunch of questions like what your regimen is. So it doesn't demand any particular protocol or any particular regimen. What they're interested in is gathering as much data as possible from as many people as possible. So they'll ask what your protocol is, what your experiences are. Over the last update, they've integrated some really interesting neuro exam type things that will assess how you're responding at more of a physical level. And I don't know, I think I put that on the next slide. Last year, when I put this together, it was over 20,000 people. This has gotten a significant amount of attention since then, and so that number is probably significantly higher. So it's a huge data pool of people who have self-reported their microdosing. So while regimented research study for microdosing hasn't been done very much. They're starting to do a little bit of that, but we do have this huge data pool of people who are self-reporting. Some of the research that has been done has shown that microdosing does upregulate something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is really important in terms of any sort of stimulation of the brain or initiating change in the brain. So in neuro rehab, in the neuro rehab realm, upregulating BDNF is really important in trying to help people work through things and improve and initiate change. And so it's not like that. Exercise is also a huge influencer on BDNF, so I always encourage people to exercise as much as possible within their limits to try to get that BDNF elevated. But microdosing has been shown to elevate brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's also been shown to have influence over neuroplasticity. In terms of neurogenesis, a smaller dose, a microdose, has actually been shown to increase neurogenesis more so than a macrodose or a full journey as it relates to psilocybin. So with the macrodose, you get that global communication that I was talking about. The brain areas start talking to each other a lot more. But in terms of the neuroplasticity, the neurogenesis, the research is actually showing that microdosing might have a greater influence on that. The research is still kind of in its infancy, but really interesting findings for sure. Also some relations to fear extinction and the connectivity between the default mode network that I talked about that's associated with the ego and tie-ins with the amygdala, which is the area of the brain that has to do with a lot of different emotions, but usually gets associated and definitely has a role in terms of fear and the trauma response. And so there's a dynamic interplay there too. The microdosing has been shown to continue to have an influence, much like a microdose or a larger dose does. And then, for me personally, working with a lot of, like I mentioned, neuro rehab type stuff, and built into the microdose.me protocol, they brought in this thing where it's a finger tap test. So it's on your phone. You just log in, you create an account, again, you tell them what protocol you're doing, and then it has different tests in there. They have some visual acuity tests, so psychedelics have been shown to increase visual acuity, especially at low doses. So that's reported. This is something that they built into it as well, and it's an element of that where you tap on the screen of your phone, and it gauges how quickly you're tapping. This is relevant because this is something that tends to decrease over time and with age, and especially when it comes to situations like Alzheimer's and dementia. This is something that I use clinically to gauge frontal lobe function. So if somebody has hypofunction, if they have an inferior lesion to the frontal lobe, this can become problematic and their finger tap will be significantly slowed down. It's the same sort of thing when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's, is that this slows down quite a bit. And what they're finding within the microdose.me is that in individuals who are older, who are having these dementias or Alzheimer's signs, with the finger tap actually speeds up after they've done their microdosing protocol or during the microdosing protocol, which is not something that's supposed to happen. Generally speaking, in the neurology realm, if that starts to wane, starts to get slower, it tends to just get slower. And so it's really interesting, and this is something that's very objective that you can point out and see that those neural connections are firing much more efficiently, and they're seeing that increase in finger tap. And then real quickly, Jason mentioned I am co-founder of a psilocybin service center in Oregon, and so if anybody's curious what microdosing looks like in Oregon, there was a lot of advocacy to not have it this way, but this is how it's laid out. So for anyone who's interested, somebody does need to come into a licensed service center, and microdoses do need to be administered under the supervision of a licensed facilitator. There's still advocates advocating to open that up as more of a prescription because it's not something that impairs you. But as is currently written, anybody who needs to come in for a minimum duration, it's 30 minutes for a microdose. Everything still needs to be done under the supervision of the facilitator in Oregon. And then these are some resources. I've got a number of books right there that have some really great information. James Fadiman's book is the one on the top left. The one on the top right is a lot more research-based and a little bit more focused on LSD, if that's your area of interest. The Mushroom Magic one is a really great one that I often recommend, as well as Fadiman's book is the upper middle. The Microdosing handbook it has prompts as well, so it kind of walks you through. It's a lot of information in terms of what the protocols are, what the reason is, some of the science behind it, but it's also like a journey journal, if you will.